Hello friends, I'm Mark Thomas. Welcome to this sixth study in the book of Revelation. I've done a series of 6 studies and this is the final one. And today's study will be dipping into Revelation chapter 21. So I hope you've got your Bible with you. Do open it to Revelation chapter 21 and we'll get cracking in a moment or two. Let's have a very, very brief summary of where we've been so far. So we've been looking at this amazing book in order to understand its implications for us and to inspire us to live faithfully for Jesus in challenging times. It's an extraordinary pastoral letter full of beautiful and mind-stretching images to stir the imagination, all with a view of helping us, as I say, helping us to live faithfully for Jesus in challenging times. And it helps us to get a heavenly perspective on our earthly circumstances. And some of the previous studies that we've done, we've taken a little time to hear the testimonies of some Christians like Suri, who found the doorway to love, the doorway to Jesus, as she read Revelation. Then there was a chap called Steve who found the curtain pulled back on the reality of suffering and the reality of hope in Jesus. And then last week, there was a little story testimony from George, who through the chaos of his life found the unshakable presence of God and found himself no longer crying for salvation, having discovered that, but singing with the unnumbered gathered, that wonderful song in Revelation chapter 7, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. That's Revelation chapter 7, verse 10. Praise that continues the echo that comes right from the Old Testament, Psalm 118, and recollects the Palm Sunday praise of the crowd as the crowd acknowledged Jesus as the coming King who brings salvation. So let me show you a couple of slides to remind us where we've got to in our studies so far. So one way of summarizing the whole book of Revelation is to do so with this phrase, to live faithfully in challenging times, and which calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints. So John's visions reveal that Jesus has overcome evil by his death and resurrection and will return one day as the true King of the world. And we've been looking at these 6 pinnacles, peaks, if you like, high points in the book. Chapter 1, it was about seeing God afresh. As in chapter 1, we discover that John praises God for what Jesus has done. Then our second study was heeding God's perspective when we looked at one of the 7 imperial proclamations, letters we call them. We dipped into the one to the church in Laodicea at the end of chapter 3. Then our third study was encountering God's majesty, as we hear in chapter 4 of the dazzling splendor that John saw, in which all of creation is caught up, not in deferential respect to the emperor, but in the worship of God, the Father, of Jesus and of the Lamb. And then we moved forward to chapter 7, picturing God's people, where we see Jesus, the Lamb of God, victorious and welcoming those who have survived many trials. Last time, we were living between the times in Revelation chapter 12. And we saw there how in John's experience, the well-known, at least at the time, story of Leto and Python is actually reinterpreted by John in a countercultural way. So not as a story to reinforce the victories and glories of the Roman Empire, but as a way of identifying Jesus as the victor over chaos, the victor over disorder and evil, and the bringer of peace, all through his death and resurrection. And so that brings us to chapter 21. And chapter 21 is about celebrating the goal of history. And that's what we're looking at. So just a few thoughts by way of background to get us going. Revelation 21 verses 1 to 14, celebrating the goal of history. There is a saying Start with the end in mind. Have you heard that one? Have you seen that one? Or begin with the end in mind. Now, this is intended to encourage people to think about where you want to end up before you start a project or a task, so that everything you do will lead towards that goal. And you will therefore, hopefully, avoid wasting time on things that are secondary and don't take you in the right direction. Well, the Christian faith is similar. In the first century, Jews believed that the resurrection of the dead would happen at the end of time and signal the end of this age and the beginning of God's promised age to come, in which evil was defeated, suffering brought to an end, and God would put all things right. Now, for Jesus's followers, that meant that the resurrection of Jesus brought this promised future into the present. When we give our allegiance to him, we begin to live this resurrection life now. Although it's not yet fully realized, it is in part present. And the final chapters of Revelation paint a dazzling picture of the end of all things, when everything that Jesus began is brought to completion. Death and pain, defeated decisively by him, will finally be brought to an end, and we will see God face to face. It's a great end to have in mind as we live out our discipleship in the meantime. So this is the structure of the verses that we're going to be looking at this evening. Verses 1 to 8 talk about the appearance of the holy city. And verses 9 to 21, which we'll spend a lot less time on, focus on the description of the holy city. Our focus will be on the first 8 verses. So why don't you pause the video at this point, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Pause the video and go and read verses 1 to 8, Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 to 8. Read those now and come back in a moment. Have you read those verses now? Amazing, aren't they? Really mind-stretching. So here's a little question just to sort of get us going. How do you imagine heaven? How do you imagine heaven? What images and ideas have you picked up which inform your imagination? Is an eternal future with God something that you're excited about? You're allowed to say no. After all, there are some traditional images and ideas and pictures, perhaps of sitting on a cloud playing a harp, that frankly don't sound that exciting at all. How do you imagine heaven? Okay, well, let's dive into the passage. And the first thing to notice, well, it is that outline. So let me just share that screen very briefly again. So the first 8 verses, as I say, are the appearance of something called the Holy City. John's vision, which begins really, another vision begins in chapter 21, runs right through to chapter 22, verse 5. And then after verse 5 of the last chapter, there's something of an epilogue to the vision report. And there we get a message about the importance of what John has written. The words are themselves important because they are the prophetic words of Jesus. But our focus is on the first part of chapter 21, the pinnacle of the book. And it's a grand final vision. And the first 5 verses have an interesting structure that it's worth noticing. So here are verses 1 to 5, glance down at them. At the beginning, verse 1, and at the end, verse 5, they both talk about something new, a new heaven and a new earth, in verse 1. And then where God says in verse 5, I am making everything new, or making all things new. Okay, they're in a sense the bookends of what we're focusing on this evening. Then a little bit further in verses 2 and verse 4, there is something that no longer happens or no longer will be present. In verse 2, it's the sea, no longer, I should say the sea. And then verse 4 talks about there being no longer death or mourning or crying or pain. Then at the center of these 5 verses is what you find in verse 3, which talks there of the holy city and God's dwelling place. And this is called a chiastic structure. And the center bit, so if I go back, you'll see the center bit there is the city or the dwelling place. That is the focus, the central focus of these opening verses, leading later on into a detailed description of what this holy city and dwelling place of God will be like and will look like. That's an interesting little structure to get your head around for the first 5 verses. We're not going to go into groups just at this point, so let me stop sharing my screen and we'll dive into some of the text. John talks about a new heaven and a new earth. Do you see that in verse 1? And we need to read the imagery here in its wider biblical context. So, for example, the idea of a new heaven and a new earth actually comes from the Old Testament. It comes from Isaiah chapter 6. And if you were to turn to Isaiah chapter 6, verse 17, you would see reference to the new heaven and the new earth. And what John does here in Revelation is that he expresses it in terms of a sense of fulfillment. The coming of the new heaven and earth fulfills the expectation of Isaiah, itself an expression of the longing that God will deliver his people, not just from sin and oppression, but from the very possibility of these things. There's also mention there of the sea, isn't there? And often the sea is symbolic of chaos and evil. The sea is sometimes seen in neutral terms as part of God's good creation, yes, and some people love the sea. But at other times in Revelation, it draws on a negative Old Testament understanding of the sea as a threatening place of unruly disorder and chaos, characterized as the deep, connected to the abyss, and from it the source of evil. And in such occasion, and on such occasions, when it's understood in that way, such as in Revelation chapter 13, verse 1, when the beast emerges from the sea, it has this negative connotation, and therefore it is good that it is no longer, as John says, it is cast away. In the new creation, there's no longer any sea because there are no parts of the renewed cosmos which defy or resist God's rule and which can be the source of evil or opposition to him or to his people. But also notice the direction in which the holy city that's mentioned in verse 2 travels. Which way does it travel? It travels down from heaven, from God. The direction of travel with the city coming down out of heaven is in line with the rest of Revelation and with other expressions of New Testament eschatology, which does not envisage the saved leaving the earth to be with God in heaven, but rather them awaiting their bodily resurrection and the return of Jesus. And this matches, in a sense, what we say regularly in the Lord's Prayer. Matthew chapter 6 contains Jesus' Lord's Prayer, and we say in the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come to us. Perhaps that's a new thought for you, not about the Lord's Prayer, but about how we see our ultimate engagement with God. It's more that he comes to us than that we go to him. The holy city is twice described, both in verse 2 and later in verse 9, as the bride. This is in anticipation of the marriage of the Lamb that is pictured here of Christ and his people being united together, being as one. There's an anticipation of this imagery in chapter 19, just a couple of pages earlier. There it is the bride who has prepared herself. Although elsewhere in Revelation, further back in chapter 12, the preparation is something that is accomplished by God. This imagery of the bride, let's think about it a little more, because in the Gospels, Jesus describes himself as the bridegroom, for example, in Mark chapter 2, and Paul also draws on this wedding analogy between Jesus and his people with references in Ephesians chapter 5. So here, the bride is clearly meant to be the people of God. The people of God are Christ's bride. And the bride is, well, it says beautifully adorned, using the word cosmio, from which we get cosmetics, as somebody that is beautifully adorned and prepared. The previous use of this personal metaphor for the people of God as the bride occurs in chapter 19, and it identifies the adornment of her fine clothing as the righteous acts of God's people. So there's a sense in which her beauty, our beauty as the people of God, is our righteous acts, are our righteous acts. Then in verse 3, for the last time in this book of Revelation, what John sees is complemented by what he hears. You see that? He says, and I heard a loud voice from the throne. Now, up until now, the one on the throne has spoken and acted through intermediaries, mostly angels, but now he acts and speaks directly and says, behold, if you like, which draws attention, of course, to the importance of what follows. And what does he say? He says, the dwelling of God is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. Now, the dwelling of God is the skene. It's the Greek word for tent. It's where we get the word scene from. And actually, it's a reference to the painted backdrop of tent material used in theatres, where they can project images and set scenes. And it alludes to the tent of meeting where God's presence dwelt with his people as they journeyed through the wilderness, which you can read about in Exodus, as well as, not just looking back to Exodus, but also what John says in his Gospels, using a term at the beginning of the Gospels to express the significance of Jesus's coming in his incarnation. The word became flesh and dwelt, skenio, to dwell among us. So the coming of God's dwelling place on earth means the end of separation between the earthly and the heavenly. Following the elimination of all that is evil and unholy by means of his victory, his judgment, if you like, and the destruction of evil that's recorded in chapters 18 to 20, God's close presence with his people is emphasized by the phrase that God himself will be with them. Later expanded in chapter 22, verse 4, as seeing his face. Then in verse 4, the close presence of God with his people continues in the affirmation that he will wipe away every tear. I'm sure that's a phrase that you've come across, that you've heard possibly. Well, this is where it is. Revelation chapter 21, verse 4. God will wipe away every tear. An idea that, in a sense, derives from the vision of the eschatological banquet that's in Isaiah chapter 25, where the shroud that enfolds all peoples will no longer do so, or will be swallowed up in victory. And that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 54, as he celebrates the victory of Jesus. John, in a sense, in Revelation, goes a little bit further than Isaiah does by expanding the banishment of death to include hope, and to include the hope that mourning and crying and pain will also be no more. Then we have the one seated on the throne, who is God, in verse 5. Remarkably, this is the first direct speech from God since chapter 1, verse 8. Now there, he declared his title as the Alpha and the Omega. And in all the intervening chapters, right from that early chapter 1 right through to this chapter 21, in all the mayhem and confusion and complexity of the world, and in the shadow of judgment as well as deliverance, God's voice and actions have been communicated primarily through intermediary agents. But the full revelation of this final redemption of the world calls forth God's direct speech in unambiguous ways. And so for the 7th time in this book, John is commanded to write. You see that in verse 5. Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." Yes, John is given trustworthy, faithful, and true words. They, of course, match the one from whom they originate. Jesus, the faithful and true witness, as he is described in chapter 3 and chapter 19. And of course, God, the holy and true one, the just and true one. That's how he's described in various places in Revelation. And then in verse 6, he said to me, "It is done," which of course echoes both the completion of creation, as recorded in Genesis chapter 1. It could also possibly echo the cry of Christ on the cross, where he said, "It is finished." Similarly, the offer to the thirsty to drink freely, as it says in verse 6, echoes both the invitation of God in Isaiah chapter 55 and what Jesus says in John chapter 7. And the nature of this offer, both as a free gift of grace and universal invitation, is perhaps emphasized in the fact that it's mentioned again in chapter 22, verse 1. This is not merely something that God gives, it's but the gift of God himself. For the Spirit is that living water as the presence of God, which is now realized in all its fullness. And the invitation is freely given it in verse 7. "Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." It's freely given, but it also needs to be received. And that reception is marked by the call for patient endurance way back in chapter 1. Faithfulness on the part of those who are conquering, or the victorious, being victorious, which was the repeated challenge and invitation at the end of each of the 7 messages in Revelation chapter 22 and 23, to those who overcome, to the victorious, to those who conquer. And if John's vision holds in tension the free offer of grace and the need to respond, it also constantly holds in tension the acceptance of the offer with the consequences of rejecting the free gift of this offer of the water of life, which is, as verse 8 graphically describes, the second death in the lake of burning fire and sulfur. Without the gift from God, life itself is extinguished. There is no sense here that human beings or their souls are inherently immortal. So as we've cantered through those first 8 verses, then perhaps here's a question that you might want to ponder on just a little bit. The city here is pictured being continually open to welcome all those who will accept the free offer of the water of life, but also closed to every evil thing. John's account of his vision emphasizes open access to the city. It has gates on every side. The gates remain open constantly, whilst rather surprisingly, the kings of the earth bring their glory into it. You see that in verse 25 of chapter 21, on the bit further on from the section we're looking at. Yet John also emphasizes its exclusivity, listing those who are excluded in verse 8, the last verse of our section, and again over the page in chapter 22, verse 15. So here's a question. Is it possible to have holiness without exclusion? The important thing to do when considering that is to ponder Jesus's example in the Gospels. Now, here was the perfect one who was yet able to eat with sinners and tax collectors without being contaminated. There may well be a measure of exclusion, but there is also the great freedom of inviting people to come and hear him and be with him and spend time with him. So it's a balancing act. How can we check the tension between inclusivity and exclusivity? It's a constant challenge to get it right, but there is something of both in God's purposes and in God's kingdom. So as we come to the end of this study, a little shorter than some of the others, and the end of our series, allow me to recap very briefly as we've cantered through some of the material in this wonderful book. I'm going to share my screen just for one final time. As we saw God afresh, and I hope that in any part and every part of Revelation, we will be able to see God afresh, and we did so specifically in chapter 1. And then we heeded God's perspective as we heard what he said to one of his churches in chapter 3, and there are 7 churches there that we can learn his truths from. We encounter God's majesty in the wonderful and glorious, dazzling images presented to us in chapters 4 and 5, which contain worship that we're invited to enter into too. And we can use the same language that is within that to worship our God. We moved on to understand God's people and what it means to be God's people, and the challenge of seeking to remain faithful to him, and yet the confidence of being able to do so because of the way in which we are saved and protected and preserved and loved by him. And then there's the challenge of living between the times, between the initiation of God's kingdom and the beginning of his rule and reign following the resurrection of Jesus, until he returns again. We live in between the times with an exhortation to be faithful to him. And then today, celebrating the goal of history, which is the marriage of Christ and his people, and Christ coming to us, God coming to us in order to make that happen and fulfill his purposes for us. So that's our study in Revelation, 6 studies in the book of Revelation. I hope they've been interesting and helpful to you. And I look forward maybe to spending time with you again, perhaps in a different book of the Bible the next time. But before we go, I really encourage you to read those first 8 verses of Revelation chapter 21 with that phrase in your mind, celebrating the goal of history. And as you do so, and as you read, and as you think on that, thank God for all that he has done for us in Christ. So, friends, do take care. God bless. I look forward to seeing you again at another time. Bye for now.